So this is about paper 2, question 3, which is the question on paper 2, which has 2 texts about a controversial language issue. Okay, so it's 2 texts on a language issue or debate, and you have to analyze them and compare them. So you do that together, like you don't deal with the text separately, you talk about them together all the way through your answer. Okay, for this question, you have 15 minutes to read and make notes. So you read the 2 texts, make your notes, plan your answer, and then 45 minutes to write it up. If you normally have extra time, that would be 20 minutes reading and note making, and then 55 minutes to write it up. It's not very long, okay? So what you need to do to make sure you're successful at this is to make sure you follow this method, this structure. So these are the things you need to be doing when you're making your notes and then when you're writing your answer. Okay, so the text will always be the kind of uninformed non-linguist point of view on a linguistic issue. So for example, if they're texts about language and gender, then there'll probably be deficit model texts that say that women need to be more direct in order to let men understand them. Or if there are texts about young people's language, they will suggest a kind of deficit view of young people's language, like young people don't talk properly, they're wrecking their chances of employment, they are changing language, maybe that link to language change, changing language for the worse. If they're texts about language change, then they'll probably be very prescriptivist and disapproving. Okay, so there'll always be the kind of uninformed non-linguist point of view. They could be on any topic that we've studied in language diversity or language change. So all of the sociolinguistic stuff from year 1, age, gender, class, region, ethnicity, representation, you know, all that stuff about politically correct language could be on any of those, or they could be on any element of language change, such as like prescriptivism versus descriptivism in a specific context, like technology is changing language for the worse, or global English is a terrible thing, like it's killing, English is killing other languages, and people don't speak English properly when they speak it in other countries. Okay, so it could be on anything that we've studied, so you've got to be ready for anything. You have past papers available to you, okay, so your teacher should have given you past papers as part of your revision booklets, so you can see the kinds of things that have come up. Okay, so it doesn't really matter what it's about, this is how you approach it. All right, so in your introduction, what are the texts about? All right, so comparing them, text A is, text B is. What opinions of the topic do they express? They'll be similar in their opinions. They might be different in their audience or their purpose, but they'll be similar in their opinions, right? There won't be much of a contrast. So they'll both be prescriptivist or they'll both be deficit. Okay. Importantly then, in your introduction straight away, what are the texts about? What opinion of the topic do they express? But then, does that fit into any existing discourses about language issues? So what do we mean by existing discourses? We mean typical opinions about language issue, okay? You need to be naming those opinions, right? So these are prescriptivist texts, you might say, if that's what they are, or they're declinist text, if you want to be more specific, or if they're about like judging young people's language, these are deficit model texts, or if they say, like, if they're men are from Mars, women are from Venus type things, these are difference model texts, etc. Okay, so you're pointing out how they're typical of texts of opinions about this particular language issue. You might not have a name for the position, you might just have to explain it. So you might say, like, these texts blame young people for decline in the language, which is typical. of opinions about young people's language, okay? But just point out that these are not like just one person's idea that exists in isolation in each of these texts. These are texts that express a, you know, a common, well-known view of a language issue. Okay, then this should be your main focus, all right? Dealing with both texts, how do they represent the topic? Okay, so using, and how do they use language to create that representation? Using your comparative language like similarly or text be also or whatever. You're writing TEA sentences here. Okay, so detailed terminology, analysis, which compares the text using those comparison words that are on the slide. And then wherever you can, try and make links to any kind of existing discourse. So not in detail, you don't want to be explaining linguistic research, you just want to be dropping the name of the position or the name of maybe like one theorist in there. So you might, for instance, say something like, this is a typical crumbling castle metaphor as identified by Jean Aitchison. Okay, now that's enough, all right? Or this is a difference model approach as identified by Deborah Tannen. You don't go into any more detail than that, right? You just name the position, because the main focus of this question is analysis, not your linguistic knowledge. So you just name that position, all right, really briefly. You need a couple of paragraphs of that. So how do the text represent the topic? Comparing, using the terminology, example, analysis, structure, and wherever you can, naming the position they're taking, like pointing out that this is typical of language discourses. Remember, they'll be using the uninformed point of view here, right? So they'll be typical of like the general public's view of a language issue, not a linguist point of view. Okay, and then on the slides that you can see, these are separate, okay, but actually it's better if you deal with these two things together. So how are the audience positioned in each of the texts? Useful to look at pronoun use here. In particular, see if, you know, there's a we, is there a pseudo community, you know? You could also talk, though, not just about pronoun use, but maybe like how much technical lexis do they use? How much like low frequency lexis? So are they assuming an audience that has some specialized knowledge here, or are they using high frequency lexis, non-technical lexis, and sort of spelling things out? You could think about where they are as well. So did this article appear in a newspaper, which anybody could have been looking at, or is it on some sort of specialist website? Okay, so for instance, a couple of years ago, we had a text about politically correct language expressing the opinion that it had gone too far, that like woke people were trying to control our freedom of speech, etc. And that was from a website called something like Political Correctness Gone Mad, or Politically Correct Madness. So that's clearly for a particular audience, right? You wouldn't sort of stumble upon that. Similarly, we had a gender, like a deficit model, gendered text, which was from a self-help book for women, you know, how to fix your relationship. So again, sometimes they're quite specific audiences, and obviously then the audience are being positioned as already agreeing with the writer. Whereas if it's just from a newspaper, anyone could stumble upon it. Maybe it has to be a bit more persuasive. Okay, so a comment or two about how the audience are positioned, that's all you need, because remember, your main focus is on how the issue is represented, which you've already done. Okay, now in the same paragraph as dealing with audience, you could now deal with producer as well, because those two things go together. So how do the producers represent themselves? Again, looking at the same things really. So pronoun use, levels of complexity or technical lexis. You could maybe look at how the author is kind of introduced, like is there a noun phrase like expert or psychologist or something like that, that kind of tells the audience that they can trust this person. Generally, the producers will try and represent themselves as authoritative in one way or another, like they want the audience to know that they're qualified to speak on this issue, you know, to say something about whatever the topic is. So they might give themselves credentials, like call themselves a psychologist or a teacher, or they might express their authority by using like lots of technical lexis. Okay, so deal with producer and audience together, because you only have 45 minutes to do this, and your main focus is on how the topic's represented. If you have time, you can do a quick conclusion, just reinforce, like, are these typical of wider discourses about the issue? Can you, you know, make another link back to those wider discourses? Okay, so after that, remember, you write question 4, which is your own article on the same topic, arguing a much more informed linguistic point of view. Okay, so always disagreeing with the text in question 3. We've talked about question 4 separately. All right, so you know how to approach that. You've got a nice plan, which will, a structure plan, which will work for any question 4, and that's in your revision resources. Okay. So just back to question 3, this is what's being marked, all right? This is what you're going to be given credit for when the examiner's marking. So lots of the marks are for terminology, example, analysis, structure, okay? So there's 10 marks for terminology out of the 40 available in total, okay? 10 marks for terminology. So do focus on, you know, the usual things that get you terminology marks, which is detail, looking for patterns, dealing with some slightly more sophisticated terminology like modality or semantic fields or syntax, okay? You get 15 marks for the analysis bit of TEA, okay? So talking about how the examples you've picked out create meaning, so how they represent the topic, how they represent the producer, how they position the audience, right? So 25 of your marks are for the TEA bit, right? Try to remember, you know, that is the most significant bit. The other 15 marks are for these two things together. So always comparing, always text A does this and text B also does this, or text A does this, but in text B, the point is made differently. So 15 marks for that, plus link to wider language debates. So that's the naming the positions, right? Saying this is a prescriptivist, declinist view, or this is a deficit view, or whatever's relevant, right? Or it's typical or for the general public to disapprove of young people's language, or this fear of language change due to technology has always existed, or whatever. Okay, so just naming those positions. So in total, you've got 40 marks there, 25 for the TEA bit and 15 for the other bit. Okay, so obviously, as always, the best way to revise is to practice with these questions. So you've got lots of past questions available to you, as well as the ones you'll be doing with your teacher and have done with your teacher. Practice is the key thing. But this slide, all right, is the important one to keep in mind. Like, that is all you can have marks for, all right? That's what the examiner's looking for. So bear that in mind, right? Know what the examiner's looking for. And you won't go too far wrong, okay? So that is paper 2, question 3.